Hello, and thanks for watching my video. My name is Kevin Sullivan. I am a global black belt specialist here at Microsoft focused on Azure migrations. And today I want to talk about Azure Arc, and more specifically Azure Arc enabled servers. And even more specifically than that, the specific free features you currently get simply by onboarding your servers, whether your servers Windows servers, Linux servers, and servers Windows Linux with or without SQL. Pinpoint all of the free features that you get simply by onboarding. And what I mean by free is obviously you have to have Azure tenant and a subscription. But if you have that, I can onboard 1, 10, 100, thousands of servers to my Azure tenant, to my Azure subscription. And simply by doing that, there are all sorts of things that I've found that many customers and even my fellow colleagues here at Microsoft sometimes don't realize that you get essentially for free. And so what I want to do today in this short video is run through some of my favorites, or at least the ones that I think are the ones that stand out the most. And so what you're looking at is I got this PowerPoint slide, and I'll share this up onto the site as well. And it has just a simple bullet list of the features, and each feature underneath has a hyperlink to that specific part of the documentation. So I'm going to run through this dozen or so things and show some demonstrations of some of these things along the way. So let's start from the beginning. So again, Arc servers are all about enabling those servers to be represented, or rather projected, into your Azure environment, so into your subscription. And the point and the objective of Arc is essentially to make those servers consistent with other Azure resources, such as Azure VMs within your Azure subscription. And not only consistent, but also take advantage of a lot of the services that those native Azure servers have been enjoying for, in some cases, many years within the lifetime of Azure and all of the features that it represents. And so the first thing when you Arc enable a server that you'll notice is that in this documentation here, I'll just pull this link up here, is fundamentally what happens when I Arc enable a server. So a server sitting on premises or maybe in another cloud, such as AWS or GCP, a representation, an object gets created to represent that Arc enabled server. And what's interesting about this is the bread and butter of a resource in Azure. There's properties such as tags, the ability to RBAC or role-based control access and delegate access to that particular resource, and also have it sit hierarchically within a resource group, within a subscription, a managed group, etc. And so if I pop over to my Azure Arc environment in my subscription, and I go to machines, I've got 6 machines here that I've Arc enabled. And in these machines, I've got a couple Linux Ubuntu distros, I've got a couple Windows boxes, and I got a couple Windows boxes running SQL. These servers are essentially outside of Azure, but they are Arc enabled, so they are represented and projected. And so as you can see, if I just click on one, you'll get a very familiar look at this. And so a lot of people would say, well, that's great, but what good is this? Well, even just simply onboarding, everything you're seeing here is for free. I'm just onboarding the Arc server. It's represented in my subscription. That gives me quite a bit of metadata underneath and a lot of data about that server simply by doing that. And so if I look at this, I follow all the rules about concept of tagging. Again, depending on some of the features you light up within your Arc enabled server, there's roles that you can assign to give people read or delegated access to these machines as well. But if we look at, going a little bit deeper, when anything that's within an Azure resource is now part of the graph. And what's interesting about that is if I want to query, in my case, maybe I want all my Linux servers within my Azure subscription or tenant or whatever I have the scope to, notice that those Ubuntu servers, these Arc enabled servers are real Azure servers, and it knows that these are Linux servers. And I can sit here and I can show you other queries too, like, well, give me all the Arc servers that are also SQL. And so here we go. That's pretty cool. I can get that information too from a query. What's even more interesting is because they're part of the graph, Well, I can create all kinds of custom dashboards about this data. So for example, maybe I want to look at all of my Arc servers and their deployment states. And so you'll notice that, here's my 6 servers that have been deployed. And let me slide this around. My resolution is a little smaller, but essentially it surfaces quite a bit of information. And what's interesting about this is not all of this information, I don't have any of the paid for servers like Azure Monitor turned on or Defender. Although I highly recommend you look at those. Those are great, and they can only make this even more valuable. But this is just the basic properties and metadata stuff that Arc onboards for you, and therefore I can make use of it. So if I go down this, some of these sample dashboards, and by the way, these dashboards are in the documentation. They're very easy just to upload and get you started. There's some pretty powerful things you can do, like, you can start looking at populations of, what distros and what OS versions of Windows am I running, or SQL, or maybe Linux, or hey, are they running databases, and if so, what kind? So you get the idea. There's all kinds of information simply by onboarding that can be gathered with just simply onboarding to Arc. So next we'll go down to the next feature, and again, notice some of these, and this is one of them. Some of these features are going to be in preview, and I've tried to mark them as such as the making of this video. And so, just take that. I tried to mark that as best I can, but it's essentially everything I'm showing you here is in a free context, simply by just the prospect of onboarding your server into Azure. And so one of these things is this site manager. And so this is kind of a basic thing, but it's actually pretty powerful. The one thing that differentiates, most things that are going to be Arc enabled, well, they don't actually exist in an Azure region because they're not Azure things. And so because of that, a lot of times those servers are sitting at a store, they're sitting in a factory, in a physical location. And gee, wouldn't it be nice if I could have like something that would make understanding of that? Sure, Azure, I can make custom tags, and you absolutely can do that as well to kind of delineate those and like do your filtering for. But this site manager thing's pretty nifty, specifically for Arc things, because you can see is you can build a hierarchical model. And once you Arc enable, I can essentially and dynamically say, well, these servers are in my St. Louis facility, or my factory in Hoboken, or wherever it happens to be, and essentially gives me those views. And it gives you kind of at least an up-down view. And if I had Monitor turned on, it would actually even surface some of the current alerts that might be going on that server as well. So again, free site managers is there. Just simply I have to onboard my servers that I wish. Okay, moving on. And this is probably my favorite, and the one that it surprises me that people don't know a whole lot about. And that is, once I Arc enable a server, and again, a Windows server or a Linux server, I have the ability to remotely access that server either via SSH or via RDP, assuming that the target server is a Windows server. So let me go back to my subscription here, go back to Arc. Let's go to some machines here, and let's look at like one of my Linux servers. And if I go in here, there's this connect button. Well, and if it's an Azure VM, it would just have a button or a just-in-time policy access. And essentially, I can just, get a session from there, right? But because it knows it's a Linux server, notice that it gives me this command line that I can issue on Azure CLI through the portal. But I already have a PowerShell window open here. So I'm going to take and try to get into that Ubuntu box. Now, look what I'm doing. All I'm doing is I'm saying it's an Arc-enabled server. Imagine the server is sitting somewhere in a physical locale somewhere. It's sitting in my data center. It's sitting in a store or whatever it is, and I just need to get access to it. But I'm not at the store. I don't have line of sight network-wise. I don't have a VPN. But I do have Azure credentials, and I can securely prove who I am, who I say I am, to be able to do this with MFA, et cetera. I just need to get into this server maybe for troubleshooting purposes. So what's interesting is I can issue this command to basically just tell, hey, Azure, go to, via SSH, go to this subscription. I put that Arc thing in this resource group, and it's the name of the server is this. And voila, I'm in. And so this is what you're looking at is you're, in the server. And so if I, it's hard to prove this out, but take my word for it. This thing's on a 1010 network, some private network, wherever it might live. And so now I have access to do whatever I need to do from that perspective. One thing I want you to realize that I did not do which is kind of another side benefit if we're talking Linux ARC-enabled servers, is we also have an extension, again, doesn't cost anything, called the single sign-on, the Entra or Azure Active Directory or Entra single sign-on extension. And so if you pair that up with this OpenSSH feature, notice who I'm logged in as. Those are my Entra credentials. That's what I log into Azure with. I don't have to do it this way, but I can configure it to where I can give groups or users access or not access to do an OpenSSH session. And notice that I didn't have to give it a pseudo username and password. I didn't have to give it the certificate to log into this. I didn't have to share it unsecurely to all my buddies and friends that need access to the server. It's using Entra creds, which have to follow all the MFA things that you have set up. And so that's pretty cool for Linux servers. And again, there's no cost to this. It's just something that's part of ARC. Before I move off of this, of course, I want to show you, I said RDP. And so notice this is almost the same. I'm going to this Windows 2019 server. But notice at the end, I gave it another parameter called --RDP. And so what that tells the extension is when I put that command in, it's going to say, oh, you don't want to SSH, but you want to go into this via RDP as soon as I get my password correct. And so what it's going to do is it's actually going to set up, think of it as a reverse tunnel. And so again, I don't need line of sight. I don't need a VPN, but I am locally logging in to this server via RDP, good old RDP. And again, I am in this server locally, as if I'm sitting right next to it, or I'm actually sitting on console to it. So again, I think, just to prove it, it's on this 1010 network alongside the Ubuntu server, but essentially you get the picture. And in this case, I can't use single sign-on just yet, but we have, you had to use the local admin password or a local user account that has RDP or a domain account. This is a domain joined system. You can do that as well. Okay. So SSH and RDP comes along for the ride. And again, probably one of the best kept secrets, I guess. So one that's pretty awesome. And so the next thing we have is run command. So just like, if I don't want to RDP, maybe I just want to run some kind of diagnostics across one or more servers, I can actually script that pretty easily now that they're ARC enabled. And so there's a run command where I can send specific scripts or command lines to a server. So for example, all of these, both Windows and Linux do it. If I move back to my Windows 2019 server and I look at, it's down here, run command. Again, this is a preview thing, but again, this just gives you an explanation of what this does. If I want to run it, I have to pop out a command line either in the portal or like I'm doing here, just give it a PowerShell if I'm running Windows, or a bash if I'm running something else. Notice that this is a little more complicated, but it's documented, essentially saying, hey, I want to run same kind of target thing. I want to target the 2019 server. It sits here. Here's my script. And just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to reboot the box. I'm just going to send it to Windows target. So shut down exe, reboot, timeout is 0 seconds. So immediately reboot. So if I run that, and if I'm quick enough, if I get over here to this is where that server lives. Notice that it's just a Hyper-V VM living. There's the virtual machine connect. So hopefully, if everything works like it should, this thing should just reboot. So again, think about that. No line of sight. I can do this without VPN, but I can do this securely because I'm using credentials that are my credentials in Entra with MFA, and I have to be delegated. Even owners have to be delegated to essentially have the ability to do these things. So I can turn this completely off if I want, but man, it's pretty awesome to have. So maybe some of your servers or all of your servers, I can have this remote run command facility, both for my Windows and Linux servers. Okay, moving on. Windows Admin Center. So for those Windows administrators out there, about 5 or so years ago, probably longer, we introduced this free HTML type of service that you can install in your environment, and then I can remotely manage any and all of them, a local Windows server or any Windows server that I have network line of sight to, and it's called Windows Admin Center. And so this talks about, yeah, this is Windows Admin Center, right? It's a web interface, and I can do remote PowerShell, and I can look at some performance metrics and remote registry, start services, etc. But the difference here, this is for ARC-enabled machines. Again, I can choose to turn this on and connect it. And once I do that, I can now get this type of view within, for my Windows machines, not Linux. This is a Windows admin console. But notice that because this Windows 2019 happens to be a Windows box, I have this blade. And for sake of time, you get the picture. If I connect into this thing, I'm going to get a view that looks like this, and I'll be able to manipulate it as if I'm running WAC or Windows Admin Center right on that server or within line of sight of that server as well. Again, just something that is there for the taking or for the use for onboarding your server to Azure Arc. Okay, and moving on to the next, if I can find my cursor. The next is Systems Management Identity, and this one's hard to demo unless you have an actual application to use it, but it's some people, I've found some customers, once they figure this out, it's pretty powerful. By default, an ARC-enabled server is issued a systems managed identity. So it becomes an object within your Entra tenant. And why that is powerful is because now I can give access to that ID as if it were a user to things like Azure Key Vault. So think of an application that's running on your directly on your server that maybe needs access to a certificate for SSL, and it's locked in Azure Key Vault. Well, how do I get to it? Well, I'd have to give it a key and a client, an app ID, and I have to secure that somewhere, and then I have to put that in my code, and I would have to essentially, figure that out. That's one option. The other option is if it's ARC enabled, because I have to run this thing outside of Azure, but I need access to that certificate, so where I store things, Key Vault. I can just simply use the managed ID, systems managed ID that's already there. This documentation walks you through a sample, which basically runs you through the process. Okay, well, this is how I would get my access token, and then use that access token to get to my Key Vault, or to my blob storage, or to my Cosmos DB, or whatever else that you've given that access to that systems managed identity within your tenant, within your subscription. Okay, and again, it's just there. There's no cost to that. It's just use it, don't use it. It's just part of the ARC way of doing things. Okay, the last thing is, you can see, like, and there's several of these. So I'm going to knock these kind of out in rapid fire situation. But if your ARC-enabled server that you're onboarding also happens to be a SQL server, you're in even more luck, because there are even more things that you can get simply by onboarding that SQL server to ARC, and then also allowing the SQL extension, which by default, it will want to just by default drop the SQL extension on to understand the SQL things underneath, so we can unlock and enable these things if you so wish, all these features. So you can see this long list of features here, and this is the documentation that talks about it. And there are differences by version. It walks you through, because there's various versions of SQL. Are you running 2022? Are you running 2012? Those types of things. But essentially, and there's also differences if you're running Windows, SQL on Windows or SQL on Linux. But essentially, you have some things like best practice migration assessment, detailed database inventory, even the ability to do Azure backup policy management, and even point-in-time restore now from the Azure portal. So for example, and I won't go through, I'll go through these rapid fire, but you can see the list here. Each one of these links will take you to details on just basic inventory, detailed inventory, BPA, analyzer, monitor, automated. Again, all of these don't really cost an Azure service fee. Notice that some of them are marked PayG or L+SA. What I mean there is that the license type. So if the SQL server that is ARC enabled is covered with a license plus software assurance, or you're paying through it for the new pay as you go, basically it's a paid license version of SQL. Well, okay, then you can use this feature, right? It lights up, it's there, right? If it's not, if it's developer edition or it's license only type of situation, that particular feature will just not be available to you. So the service itself doesn't cost anything, but what would, the assumption is that these things like monitor and all the things that are marked with the L+SA and PAGE, they are licensed appropriately, and that's how you have them enabled. Okay, so let's go through this kind of rapid fire motion. So let me go back to my Azure portal. And you'll notice that in my Azure portal, if I go back to Azure Arc, and there's all these machines. And so you can tell by the names, there's a couple of machines here that are SQL servers. There's SQL 22, ArcBox SQL. But what's interesting is if I, fire this up, you can see it's, well, this happens to be a Windows box. It just happens to be running SQL. And so you'll notice in the operations, there's a SQL Server configuration. So what this allows me to do is you can say, oh, hey, I've got, some information that I'm a SQL server. I've got one or more instances. They're called this. This is the version of SQL. This happens to be a developer edition SQL. I can even tell it, what is my license, right? Basically, so I know, what kind of SQL server it is, how I'm paying for it, that type of thing. I can have that enabled appropriately as well. And I can also do things like there's things that if it's a licensed version of SQL, such as this one is, I know it's developer, but I, have it marked as with software assurance. I can turn some certain things on. So one of those things is updates. And so as you can see here, I can turn on things like automated updates with a simple maintenance schedule. So if I just want my SQL server, I just want to be, maybe I have an update process, that's fine too, but maybe I want to have a maintenance schedule just to make sure, just for my SQL things and the windows underneath, at least the critical and important, I can do this. By the way, we can do Azure Update Manager, and it points it out here. That is a paid-for service. Again, that's not free, but essentially that's a more comprehensive way, just not SQL and Windows, but everything you've got. Because you're Arc-enabled, you can do that too. So this is basically just pointing this out. So then once I have my SQL box, I can then start doing some specific things around the instance itself. So let me scroll back here. So what I'm going to do now is if you'll notice down here in Arc, there's this concept of data services. And so it sees these instances. And so if I go back to one of my Arc enabled SQL boxes, it's the same but different kind of blade. You'll see that there's different settings. So let me go down like some of the, again, if we're talking, some of these are for all SQL, some of them are for, well, they're PAGE or licensed for SA. So let me just kind of walk down the things that you get for free in a license plus SA server, et cetera. And so one of those things is Entra ID. So I can come in here and I can, SQL, if it's a SQL 2022 or above server, I have a third authentication type, which is to use my users and groups within my Entra ID to basically be SQL DBAs or have roles on that local instance of SQL. They don't have to be in Azure. They just have to be Arc enabled, right? And so you can see this is where I would configure that. The other one that's linked in there, again, that comes with, just, hey, it just happened to Arc enable. I can turn on the best practice assessment. And so again, this isn't going to charge any money like Azure Monitor would. It does use Azure Monitor. It uses a log analytics workspace to do this, but essentially this is just part of onboarding your SQL server, your paid for SQL server to Arc. And so essentially this gives you a best practice assessment results. And what this will show you is, and again, you can have this run on a periodic basis, maybe every couple of days or maybe every week, to essentially give you some recommendations and some trending analysis of what's going on that particular server. So there we go. And so you can see that, these SQL servers, I haven't done anything with them, so there's tons of issues here. But essentially what's nice is it provides a trending analysis too. And so it actually over time would give you insights on certain things the longer you allow this to run. So that's the best practice assessment analyzer. Again, we talked about updates. You can see I have it turned on, but again, it's the basic. I can a little plug for the comprehensive one, which is Azure Update Manager, but the kind of the light version is there just for being there. The other thing that's cool is it's, here's the instance, but here are the actual databases. So I can get all kinds of information about my databases that it detects on the instances that I've Arc enabled, right? So, and that even includes things like setting backup policy. So this is the instance level, or, I can set a specific database backup policy for that particular database in this case, if I so choose. By the way, because of this, because it gets down to that level into the instance, into the database, it also allows me to do things like this. Going back to those dashboard views, you can see there's a couple in here that are interesting, such as this SQL Server inventory specifically for Arc. There's all kinds of, again, for free information, I can start to create dashboards and reports and queries about concerning my environment, whether or not my databases are encrypted, whether I've got the appropriate edition types going, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so go back to my instance here. And so we've got databases, and then we even have the performance dashboard is surfaced. If I have a paid for version of SQL, I Arc enable it, the same performance dashboards you can get with the SMSS, the SQL or the SMSS, the Management Studio, SQL Management Studio, since I believe version 17 or so. I can now surface those and delegate access to these as well. So essentially, I Arc enable. I'm in Azure looking at this on my local SQL server that is probably sitting in my data center somewhere, or maybe in AWS. And then the other thing that we have is assessments. So maybe you're looking at this as kind of a stepping stone. Maybe I just want to Arc enable my SQL servers and say, what does my readiness look like? What's my confidence level that I can get this thing, maybe convert it to a PaaS SQL MI instance, or I just want to lift and shift it to a SQL server on Azure VM, or maybe I want to go full PaaS and I want to convert this, the databases that are particularly here. And which databases are those to an Azure SQL database, right? A true PaaS instance. And so what this does is, and you can see it's got click-throughs, it'll tell you information about, well, how confident, and the confidence rating gets better as time goes on. It runs this constantly to basically see if there's any changes or how the database is interacting with, your applications, et cetera. And it basically gives you suggestions and warnings and, maybe showstoppers if, hey, SQL MI versus VM and DB. And it also gives you information like, well, what are suggested sizes based on how this thing is provisioned, how big is it today, and how is it being used, or how taxed is it, type of information. And the last thing I have, and I believe if you go to like databases, you can also do, and this is where I sometimes, there we go to backups here. I can actually even do things like this, and which is all those backups I can manipulate. I can even do point in time restores, again, from paid for versions of SQL. If I have, if I have a backup policy that's backing up log files on a regular basis, in this case, every 5 minutes, 12 hours differential, et cetera, I can take advantage of that, and I can even do point in time restores for those databases as well. So really lots and lots of good things, even just for SQL itself, but on top of all the other things we can do on Windows and Linux as well. Pretty interesting stuff. And so with that, I hopefully that information was useful to you. I hope that you found a couple of things that you find interesting here. And again, bottom line is simply just onboarding those servers to Arc opens up a lot of very nifty and useful things for the price of zero. As I hopefully was able to demonstrate here. Thanks for your time.